This is the Anthrobiology Podcast, hosted by me, Gabby LaPera. Every 2 weeks, I interview a biological anthropologist about what makes us, us. Before we get started, I wanted to let y'all know that our guest today, Romano, has a book coming out on June 9th. It's called Stories from Maine Cemeteries, Lives Cut Short. If you like today's episode, I strongly encourage you to check it out. Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Anthrobiology Podcast. Joining me today, I have Mr. Ron Romano. He is a cemetery historian and author. This episode is slightly different. You might have noticed I said historian instead of anthropologist. That's because anthropologists and historians often work hand in hand, and we need people like Ron to help us understand some of the stuff that we're seeing in situ when we're digging up graves. So I'm very excited to have you here today. Thank you so much for joining us.
I'm happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
So the reason I actually invited you on the show is because I took a vacation to Portland, Maine, and I had a wonderful time. And I had a couple of beers, and I stumbled into Eastern Cemetery, where I met a lovely tour guide who told me that you were the person to talk to about iconography in colonial and basically American cemeteries through now, which is pretty cool. So I'm very excited to have you on this show.
Me too. I love this stuff.
It's so good. No, a strong recommendation to anyone who happens to be in Portland, Maine. Eastern Cemetery was a delight, and the tour guide was amazing. And your one of the organizations that you partner with is Spirits Alive.
Right.
And they help upkeep the cemetery. This is something that I think is becoming more and more common, is people investing in their local historic cemeteries and bringing them back up, like doing conservation work, and then also just like doing actual maintenance, because cemeteries really are wonderful spaces.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think the interest really became evident during pandemic, because at that point when people were locked in or could go outside only to, spaces that were not crowded, cemeteries actually saw a pretty big influx of people just walking, just getting out of the house and walking, and then starting to discover things. And more people are working on their family trees. So yeah, I think historic cemeteries are really seeing an upswing in the number of visitors, which is we love that, to see that actually. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's actually really cool, because there was a movement in cemeteries in the 1800s where they wanted them to be park-like. They wanted people to come and sit and visit with their relatives, which actually I think just brings us to the topic of today, which is cemeteries. And well, actually, I should ask you, cemeteries in what time period are we going to discuss today?
So my area of research and interest really is the 19th century. And there's a huge change that occurred during the 1800s. Really, that's why I love that century. Everything changed from the colonial, which had moved into the federal period, and there was some differences there in what we see in iconography and even stone materials. And then a huge change occurs around 1850 with the rise of the garden cemetery, or the rural cemetery that you mentioned. That's when everybody said, we want to have these inviting places to go. And they specifically designed landscapes to encourage visitation. The former sites were colonial burial grounds that were truly just public spaces, like a public garden. And people would go and bring their deceased relatives and dig a hole themselves and bury them, and then try and find a marker for them. So it was a whole change in the way things operated when the garden, or really we call it the rural cemetery movement, is sometimes we call it the garden cemetery, when that started in the 1830s and 40s and just exploded and changed everything. Yeah.
Yeah. I think there's like so much information to get into. I'm trying to think of the best way to start. I think let's start with maybe just a little description of what cemeteries were like in colonial times.
Great. That's a great starting point. And I do a lot of presentations to folks about cemetery landscape history and symbolism and materials. And I always start with that. I mean, it's the best way to sort of get into the subject. So when we think about colonial New England, there really were three kinds of burial spaces that we see. The first was private family lots. And especially in rural areas, people that were farming, they just set aside a patch on their own land to bury their dead. It was just the way it was. And there were far more of those private family lots than anything else. The second category was the public space, and that was called a burying ground if there was no church associated with it. But if it was attached to a church or meeting house, it was called a churchyard or a graveyard. So those are really the same time period, but they had different meanings at the time. Again, it was associated to churches or not. And then in the middle of the century is when everything changed, and it was the rise of the garden or the rural cemetery movement. And that was really, it started in London because they were so overcrowded. Their churchyards in the town were so overcrowded over there, and just bodies piled one on top of another, and horrible odors that were coming from these graveyards. And they were trying to find solutions to that, and they developed the idea of let's move outside the city and move all these graves out. That came over to Mount Auburn Cemetery in Massachusetts first. That was about 1830s. And then we started to see other places pick up the idea of moving, actually moving bodies outside the city or setting up spaces outside the city. So the evolution really goes from sort of the private and the public spaces into these rural cemeteries as well. And so that's sort of the way that went. Once the garden or rural cemeteries got set up in many communities, there was a big push to get people to close down their private lot to move the bodies into those spaces. And so, for example, in one town where I do cemetery tours, in 1870, there's a map that shows all the private property, and almost every other home has a burying ground in it because that's what they did. Once the town opened up its public cemetery and encouraged people to move out, more than half of those were emptied out and everybody moved into the newer space. So even though, like where I live in Maine, we have over 7,200 known cemeteries, many of those are not existent because everybody just got disinterred and removed to the newer spaces once that happened. Yeah.
Yeah. I think there's a few different things that you can see in this transition. One was like this idea of hygiene.
Yeah.
Another was kind of the beginning of the Romantic period, where you see that in like the design of the cemeteries, where people were very interested in nature,
Right.
and communing with the outdoors. You also see, I think this is just the nature of humans. When you have a family burial plot, you're only comparing your burial to the other burials there. Once you have these like public burial plots, you have a lot more interesting art because people are comparing against other burials.
Yes.
And so you start seeing these changes. So, sorry, it's my dog who was apparently asleep under my coffee table. Sorry. So yeah. So you've always had this like grave iconography from the beginning, but because you have people starting to compare against each other, you maybe had every once in a while like a wealthy person have some sort of small monument somewhere, but now you have a lot more built up cemeteries as time goes on. Speaking of iconography, should we do the same thing? Should we start in the colonial period and kind of move our way through the Civil War?
Yeah, we can do that. But let's go back for a minute and talk a little bit more about what you just mentioned about the space. What you say is exactly correct. It's what happened. And because they were designing these new spaces to be so different from what we saw in the colonial period, they jammed bodies in wherever they could fit them. So there's all these haphazard rows of stones, just one after the other, where people were crammed in it. It's because it was utilitarian space. It wasn't anything more than that. And when they decided to create these rural cemeteries, they specifically created them with curved pathways, natural hillocks. They took advantage of whatever water was there, natural springs and ponds. They planted beautiful trees and shrubs all over the place. And it was all about nature, and it was a very inviting place. But the piece that's part of that too is that the well-to-do people in town would purchase these grand lots there, circles and geometric shapes, not just rows of stones anymore. And they would try and outdo themselves with monumentation. So we see obelisks like crazy, statues are up, really interesting large central family monuments on these lots. And it was a way for them to show off their wealth. and to outdo each other. My lot next to this guy is going to look better because I'm putting up a giant obelisk and he's only got something else, kind of thing. But it encouraged people to go in and spend Sunday afternoons with their families,
Yeah.
picnicking and just visiting and the whole thing. So yeah, I mean it's true what you say, that the change that occurred and the ability for people to kind of show off, it's interesting to see how that evolution took place. The downside is for those of us who are studying, our family trees or studying genealogy and trying to figure out who people are and where they were, there's so many bodies that were removed from one burial ground to the next that records get difficult to follow sometime. So where I'm at in Portland at Eastern Cemetery, which is our oldest cemetery, it goes back to, well, you took a tour, 1668. So it's 350 years old. We've got records of over 7,000 burials, but I was able to document over 700 removals. And that's 10% of the population there got dug up and sent someplace else. So even though some burial records still keep people at Eastern, that's not where they are. So it creates this challenge for those of us doing family tree stuff. But anyway, just kind of a sidebar to that. But yeah, so talk about, you wanted to talk about iconography or materials? What did you
Um,
say you wanted
I think
to
we
know?
should definitely talk about both.
Okay.
Yes, let's talk a little bit about iconography. So I'm like semi-familiar with this because I've dug up my fair share of historic cemeteries in the South. Um,
When you say dug up, you don't
with
mean
permission.
actually digging up.
With
Okay.
permission.
Oh, all
There
right.
was
Yeah.
digging involved, but
Oh, there was. Okay. Okay.
everyone was aware. Families had signed off.
Okay.
Everyone was okay with it.
Good.
There's
Yeah.
no grave robbing here.
Great.
But yeah, so no, iconography. So I think one of the things that we've kind of alluded to already is people have this changing attitude towards death. And you can see that in the way that they've constructed their cemeteries. But an even more direct way of seeing that is in the iconography that they use
Right.
when they are creating grave markers, monuments, whatever you want to call it.
Yeah.
So I think, like you said, like the older cemeteries is just kind of, it's very utilitarian. Also,
Yeah.
people died at such a rate,
Right.
such an insane rate, that it makes sense. It's a little bit more utilitarian, but it also goes back to attitudes of death at the time where it was really just memento mori. Like, we're all dust in the wind.
Yeah.
I know Kansas wasn't around at the time, but
Yeah.
you know, it was very much about reminding people that this is the next thing for you. You're going to die.
Right.
We're all going to die.
Right.
That's
And,
it.
live a sin-free life. It's the only way to, get to the next level. And, that was really the reminders of death were to remind everyone to live the best life that they could.
Yes.
So you're right. So the evolution with respect to iconography reflects that exactly. So the earlier designs that we find on markers were specifically reminders of death. So there's skulls, there's crossed bones, almost like a pirate flag, sometimes the skull over the crossbones. Sometimes we see coffins actually carved on. There's a more common one, which is an hourglass, which is the passage of time. And sometimes they depicted the hourglass with wings, which is, time flies, basically.
Yeah.
That's the
Tempus
current
fugit.
way of thinking. Yeah, exactly. So we went from the reminders of death through pickaxes and shovels and hourglasses and bones on the stones to a notion that the grave is really the place for the holding of the mortal remains, but the soul is going to rise to heaven. So they started to put wings on the skulls. And then as people got a little tired of the morbid look of the skulls and wings, the carvers started to use human faces. So we call them soul effigies because they weren't really what the person looked like. They were, in fact, a soul effigy, but it was a winged human face. And then, so that was really takes us through about the federal period. But, early in the 1800s, we see a rise of urns and willows as the predominant design on stones. And that's really from about 1800 to probably 1840 or 50. And the urn is a funerary urn. So even though we weren't cremating people, it was a revival, architectural revival image that was showing up in architecture and other, buildings and structures and art and design. So it showed up on grave markers as well. So the willow tree that's paired with it most often, because it's usually the urn and willow together, but sometimes they're separate. The willow is a weeping willow, so that's the sense of mourning. So you have death and mourning, urn and willow together. And then by the mid-century, when the rural cemeteries had really taken off and people were outdoors and enjoying nature, we see a real shift to the natural world. So there are some grave markers that are shaped like stone wall. They're actually formed like stones and they look like stone walls. There's all kinds of three-dimensional flowers, trees, beauty of nature. Wreaths are on them. And so that was the shift that we see over time. And then sadly, by the end of the century, once the machine age sort of comes into play and the stone cutters who are doing all this work by hand are being replaced by machines because they're now cutting into granite, which is a very hard stone. The shift really, unfortunately, went to just putting names on markers. So the more modern markers that we've seen ever since the 1900s are somewhat boring compared to what we see in the colonial period because many of them are just a family name. And so it's helpful to those that are doing their genealogies, but for those of us that are wandering around looking for cool stuff in the cemetery, not a lot to look at.
Yeah.
So yeah, so it's a cool sort of evolution on that. And along with that, each grave marker not only has a design, but it also has an inscription. And so even the wording changed over time. So we moved from talking about moldering in the dust and that kind of stuff to all the way up to the more modern time of here lies the body of, or in memory of, more gentle reminders of that person.
Yeah, certainly. I think that was a very good reminder that people were making these gravestones or monuments by hand previously, which brings up the question of cost, right? Like not everyone
Yeah,
is going to be able to afford that kind of
right.
memorial.
Yeah, yeah, so for sure. So my research and work at Eastern in Portland, I wrote a book about our first stonecutter who arrived in Portland. He was really in southern Maine. He was the first successful stonecutter. He was Bartlett Adams. He showed up in 1800. Prior to his arrival on scene in 1800, anybody that was buried at Eastern Cemetery was going to just have a homemade marker. The family would stick a wooden stake in the ground or a piece of found stone or field stone to mark the grave. Unless they were well to do, they would then be able to take a packet ship to Boston, which is 100 miles away, to visit a Boston stone shop and get a finished stone and bring it back. So I'm sure you saw when you toured Eastern Cemetery, we do have some of those early Boston markers on site that have survived. We've got about 125 of them from Boston. But when Bartlett Adams showed up in 1800, all that stopped. And so we have no Boston markers of those designs after his arrival. He was brilliant. He set up a stone shop 2 blocks away from the cemetery. So this pent up demand among the citizens was, why take a ship to Boston? We can just walk down the street to Bartlett Adams shop and get a stone. And so he was super busy early on and really filled a void that had existed by carving multitudes of stones for families, many of them backdated because they're not all just for people who died in 1800 and beyond, but he was doing stones for people they had lost in the 1780s and 90s. So, I mean, it really did change the look of the landscape when he showed up. But he was, he did it all by hand and he trained other guys in his shop, and two nephews were in his shop as well, to cut by hand. And they were true artisans, they were true artists. And he actually called himself a sculptor for a little while. He was proud of his abilities. And then I think after a little while, when he realized he wasn't going to do any sculpture like statuary because he was too busy just cutting grave markers, his advertisements changed and he was just calling himself a stonecutter. So he took a step back.
I think that's actually that one of the things that you mentioned, I want to pull out for any of our potential archaeologists listening to the show, which is we talked about the evolution of iconography over time. But like you said, sometimes people are putting up markers way after the fact. And so the iconography is not going to necessarily match the time period in which the person died.
Right.
So that's one of the clues that you have, right? That this happened, that this marker came up a lot later.
Right. That is one of the clues. And the other thing is when we get those of us who study the lettering and get to know each carver and their style, it's easier for me to go in and identify a Bartlett Adams marker, one from his shop, even though it's got a 1785 date on it, because I know what his work was like in 1805 when he was here. But to the ordinary sort of passersby going through the cemetery, they wouldn't necessarily see that. But yeah, so that's one of the clues is the decoration, but also the lettering. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I think the other thing that was really impressed upon me at Eastern Cemetery was writing all of those inscriptions was really hard. And you needed
Yeah.
to save space because they were charging you by the letter.
Right, right. Yeah. So the trend that I found with the Adams experience in Portland is that early on, he was cutting stones that were quite simple. He put a beautiful urn or a flower or something on the top of the marker and he'd do the inscription. But there's often two parts on the inscription panel. One is the inscription itself, which is going to be the name, the date, the age they died, and a relationship. But there may be an epitaph below that. And the epitaph is the smaller lettered verse, which is sometimes religious, sometimes humorous, sometimes sad, all kinds of things. And early on, I don't think he had time to do that. He was just busy getting the backlog taken care of. Later on, he's putting a lot of epitaphs on the markers as well. So we see sort of the three part, the decoration, the inscription, and then the epitaph. But yeah, I have a receipt from him. I think it was about 1810. He did a marker for a family, and he actually says on it 3 cents per letter or 10 cents per letter. I forget which it was, but he was charging extra per each letter. So for people that were on a budget, yeah, they weren't going to have anything more than just the basics written on their stone.
Yeah.
And I also, you asked about cost. I've got some examples of what people paid for their markers in the 1800 to sort of 1825 window. And a regular slate marker that would have a nice decoration and inscription and maybe an epitaph was running in the $5 to $20 amount. And that's early 1800s dollars, which it's hard to make the comparison today, but it's probably at least 1,000.
Yeah.
So it wasn't a cheap thing to have a grave marker made. It isn't today either. I mean, it's cost a lot of money today, but yeah.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. Yet again, the intersections of wealth and status.
exactly.
One thing that I would like to mention, just in case anyone ever needs a fun fact at a party, is if you go into a lot of these older cemeteries, most bodies are buried on an east-west axis.
Right.
And that is because if you are Christian, you believe that Christ will rise in the east, right?
Yes, correct.
Yes. And so when he
Yeah.
rises, all of the dead stand up, and that way they are facing Christ when he appears.
Right. So that's exactly right. A colonial in our area, I mean, in our part of the world, in New England, bodies were buried east to west. So there were two markers. There was a headstone and a footstone, and the inscriptions on each were facing outside the grave. The head was buried to the west and the feet to the east. And you're right. The belief there was that this was a deathbed and that the bed was for the mortal remains, but that the soul would rise on resurrection day. So it needed to be facing east. So you're picturing on sunrise, everybody's kind of leaning up in their deathbed towards the sun. Yeah. So what's interesting, I found a really cool quote from a minister in the around 1850, 60 timeframe when the rural cemetery movement had arisen and all these people were buying geometric lots and putting people in circles and all this kind of stuff. And he said something like, we used to believe that we needed to bury bodies east to west to meet their savior, but yeah, they'll find the savior whichever way we bury him now. It doesn't matter anymore. So you go to some of these really nice rural cemeteries, you find circular lots where people are all buried in a sort of wheel and spoke direction facing a central monument. And, I always think of that quote from that guy that he was like, they'll find their savior. No, don't worry about it. So yeah, that was one of the big changes that occurred in the middle 1800s. And at the same time, what is true today is when you go to a cemetery and you're visiting a loved one's grave, the inscription is facing the body. So we bury people with the stone, the inscription facing, and that was not the case before. The inscriptions were all on the outside of both the headstone and the footstone. And the reason for that was a practical one because people could walk up and down each row and see who was buried in that grave without stepping on the grave itself. And that was not out of disrespect for the dead. It was out of safety concerns. I mean, these colonial burial grounds, because they were people were buried by their family members, they would dig a hole 2 to 3 feet deep. That they would only go as deep as they needed to get the body in the ground and then cover it up. And if they were a body that had only been wrapped in a winding cloth or maybe put in a wooden box, that would deteriorate relatively quickly and create indentations in the ground. So you just didn't want to walk on the grave sites. So that was another big change that occurred, in modern times with these standards about 6 feet under and concrete vaults and all this kind of stuff that prevent that from happening. But yeah, very different time from days gone by to what we're dealing with today. Yeah.
Yeah, certainly. Casket design changed really significantly. As you mentioned previously, there's frequently just burial shrouds, simple pine boxes. Mm-hmm. As time progressed, caskets became more and more complicated, kind of culminating during the Civil War.
They needed to, right? I mean, they were moving so many bodies then, yeah. And that's when they brought embalming. That's when they perfected embalming as well.
Yes.
Because there wasn't a lot of embalming until Civil War period. And you're right, that really was the change there.
Yeah. The Civil War was a really interesting period in how I think it's hard for people to understand how many people died during the American Civil War. Like, percentage wise, it was a huge, especially in the South, it was a huge amount of the young male population was just gone.
Yeah.
But these ideas about death that existed before the Civil War that affected how people ended up treating death during the Civil War, right? So there was this concept, there's this idea of something called the good death. And I'm not telling you in particular, because I'm sure you already know about this, but for our listeners.
But no, please, yeah.
There's this idea of a good death. And for Christians, this idea of the good death was that someone who goes very peacefully, who's like smiling beatifically, that's a sign that that person is probably going to heaven because they're ready to meet their maker. They're joyfully meeting God. People who go like very violently or in like upsetting ways, it's less likely. Like it might be that they've done something wrong, that they're not as likely to go to heaven.
Mm-hmm.
So you pair that with the Civil War, where young men are dying very far from home, and families
horribly
violently, and families are upset.
With disease.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it wasn't just that they were having war wounds. It was disease was rampant. Mm-hmm. I mean, it was horrific. Yeah.
Yeah, and families are understandably very upset about this, and they want evidence that their loved one died as peacefully as possible. And so you see a lot of letters from friends writing to the family saying like, oh, he died probably a lot nicer than he actually did.
Yeah.
But then you also see, as you mentioned, embalming was perfected during the Civil War, and these embalmers would like help create these kind of peaceful death facades. And what I said about the coffins, we have the invention of the iron coffin, the iron casket.
Yeah.
I think the pinnacle of which is the Fisk metallic burial something. I can't remember what it's called. It's Fiske if you ever want to look it up.
I've seen it, yeah.
Yeah. And
I saw ads for it, I think, in the newspaper.
Yeah, yes.
Yeah.
And they're spectacular. They're like these sarcophaguses that they have created out of iron. And the whole point of these was that you could seal them shut, and the body would only first they were embalmed, but the body would also only decompose as much as air was in the coffin.
Right.
And so the decomposition process would actually stop. And so a lot of these coffins actually had these little glass windows over the faces.
Right.
So when it got home, the family could look upon the peaceful face of their dead son or brother or husband or whoever and feel more assured that they died a peaceful death, which is the whole thing is incredibly sad.
It is incredibly sad. But don't you also think that just being able to, regardless of how the person died, whether it was disease or in a war wound or whatever, that the families would have had some comfort in getting that body back home for burial?
Yeah.
Because, how sad to be killed on a battlefield far from home and then just buried in a hole there. So I think the whole notion of moving so many bodies in the Civil War back to their homes, it really was the right thing for society to do.
Yeah.
Just to give comfort to the people that, had lost their sons and brothers and fathers and everything else. Yeah.
Yeah. No, certainly. It's interesting because like you look at it from that perspective and it's so human. All of the things that have happened are so human. It's people wanting to grieve and feel connection. And at the same time, you see the commercialization of these very same processes.
Oh, yeah. Well, that's the American way. Right.
Exactly. So, sorry, I feel like I just went on a little rant, but this is actually something that I've been really interested in for a very long time. People periodically, especially on the East Coast, will find one of these metallic coffins, and a lot of times they're still intact.
Yeah, I know. It's a little bit creepy. Yeah, so the viewing glass, actually, they used to also put them in some wooden coffins. So, because earlier than the Civil War, when they hadn't perfected embalming, obviously, when somebody died, they needed to get him in the ground relatively quickly. So burial was often a couple days after death. There was little time for them to grieve and mourn over the body. They would call their families together and the neighbors would all come, but then they would get the body in the ground very quickly. But there were some wooden coffins that had a glass plate in them as a viewing glass that would allow them a couple extra days before burial. And in fact, we have a whole series at Eastern in Portland, a series of underground tombs. You probably saw them on your tour, that they were all 4 lines of underground tombs for well-to-do families. And a couple of them we've been into because there was concern about the structural integrity of the site. And they found very few human remains, but a lot of dust from boxes and things. But there wasn't a plate still there, a glass plate that was the only thing left from a coffin, which was the viewing glass, which I found fascinating. That more than anything else, really. It's just like, yay, that there was actually one of those here. But yeah.
Yeah, no, it's super interesting. But actually, I wanted to ask you a little bit about what you said about getting people in the ground fairly quickly. Presumably in the summer in Maine, fairly easy. In the winter, I imagine that's tough.
Right. So it was impossible. Yeah, it wasn't even tough. It was just impossible. So frozen ground prevented burials in the winter. So if somebody died from, say, December to March, that's kind of the period where the ground is not going to be diggable. So they had to figure out a way to store bodies. Now, because we were such a rural state, most of the people were, there was so much people living outside the towns, they stored bodies in their own barns. So it was just, that's what you did. You had animals in the barn and your equipment in the barn and the body was in the barn until spring thaw allowed burial. But in the towns, they would either construct an underground tomb or a hillside tomb called a receiving tomb, or in many cases, they would do an above ground wooden structure called the dead house. It was basically a wooden shack or a small barn, and it would be on site of the burying ground. That's where they would put the bodies. So that's what they would do. And then come spring, as soon as they could dig a hole, they would move those bodies to the final resting place relatively quickly, because you got to do that,
Yeah. Yeah. Otherwise, disease.
Exactly. Yeah.
And also, it smells
a little unpleasant.
Yeah.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah. And those family vaults also are actually really interesting. A lot of those are kind of like sunk into the ground. And so there's stairs that go down into them.
Right. Yeah.
And then when you open them up, it's like a human-sized wine cellar.
Right.
With just slots for bodies. But what's interesting is, like, eventually you run out of space. So right. Sometimes people get rotated in and out. Those are also a fairly interesting set of remains if you ever can get your hands on them.
Yeah. So our tombs were mostly single room, small spaces, but they crammed everybody in like sardines. And rather than remove anyone, they just piled them on top of each other. So there was one that had a failure a few years ago in the stairwell. And when the city went in to figure out what to do, they took pictures of what they found inside. And it was basically standing about 5 feet tall. There were probably 6 coffins that were piled one on top of the other. The bottom one was just dust mostly. The next one up was really crumbled and in pretty bad shape. The next one up a little bit better. So that went up the line. And basically what that told us was they just stacked them on top of each other and let them all deteriorate away over time. A little sad, but that's what they did out of necessity. I mean, these tombs hold up to 30 people, and some of them were crammed full. So big families, lots of bodies, and just, put them in as tightly as you can.
One of my, I think favorite stories is the wrong word, favorite illustrations of the amount of death, especially in the colonial period that we're talking about, is in Jamestown, Virginia. They built a little governor's palace, and no one could figure out why one of the corners kept sinking. And it turns out that there used to be a well there, but between the colony being founded and 30 years later them building this tiny governor's palace, so many people had died that no one remembered that the well was there.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So
I thought you were going to say they put bodies in the well. That's what I
no.
was waiting for you to say. Oh, okay. That would be a cool story.
Yeah. Don't worry. They found plenty of other bodies at Jamestown.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, I bet they
So
did.
many bodies.
Yeah.
They actually have a churchyard there too. Well, the whole quote unquote discovery of Jamestown was also, that's its own interesting story in its own
Yeah.
in its own right. But we are not here to talk about
No,
Virginia.
and we're not here to talk about New Orleans either, but let me just throw a quick New Orleans story in.
Please do.
So about the whole piling up of bodies, one of the old cemetery in New Orleans, it's all above ground because they can't bury below, for the water table. So everybody's stacked up. And when we visited there, they showed us a family tomb and burial site, which they would put the body, it was almost like a big oven, kind of. They would put the body in and they would let it just deteriorate there. And then after 20 years or something, they would open the door and they would push all the dust and few bones to the back and they would go down into a hole or something, put the next body in. So it was kind of like this constant refreshment of a new body and the old stuff being pushed down in the back. I'm not describing it well, but it was fascinating that was the way they handled that situation of lots of bodies and not enough room to bury them in.
I've always really liked that idea because one, it saves a lot of space, but two, it's if you like your family, it's not a bad way to spend eternity all commingled in there together.
Yeah, exactly. Right.
Yeah. Okay. So I think we've covered a lot of stuff. Is there anything that we haven't touched on that you would like to talk about?
I mean, I think we were talking about iconography a little bit, and I think we may have sort of veered off onto something else, which is all good. But there was a couple other things just to mention about the mid-century symbolism, and that is, I think we had talked about that by the mid-century, it was all about nature. So there's a lot of flowers and wreaths and the beauty of nature there. But the other thing that we see a lot of is the age indicators on markers. For example, lambs. When you see a lamb on a mid-century marble stone, you don't even have to look at the inscription. You know it's for a kid. I mean, it was just the innocence of the lamb shows up all over the place on markers. When you see a wheat sheaf, without even looking at the inscription, it's going to be for a person who reached a ripe old age because the wheat sheaf is a symbol of the end of the harvest, and so therefore the end of the person's life. And then there are symbols such as broken columns, architectural columns that have a break in them. And people might think, oh, look at that. That was, vandalized or that broke. That was an intentional break. Life cut short is the symbolism there. And then on trees, we see broken branches. On some of the flowers that are displayed, you see a very visible broken bud or a wilted flower. And all of that is bringing to notion the end of the life cut short, the life cut off. And kind of interesting how over time the symbolism changed both from the perspective of who was carving it and what they wanted to carve and what people wanted on their markers, because they would ultimately be the ones deciding what they wanted on their gravestones.
Yeah. Oh, actually, you know what? There is another thing that I wanted to ask you a little bit about. So Eastern Cemetery, I know that there are different burial grounds for African Americans in the cemetery.
Yeah, the segregation.
Yeah.
You want to talk about that?
Yeah, I'd love to talk about that.
Do you want me to talk about it?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, so it's really, it is a true reflection of the community at the time. Mm-hmm. So when we look at an overview map of the cemetery, we look at where the original entrance is. From the original entrance coming into the cemetery, which was then called the burying ground, of course, but coming into that space was all the white Protestant majority people. They claimed all that space, and that's where they buried everybody. If you look in the far back corner from one side, African American patch. If you look on another far back corner, Quakers. And then ultimately the third far back corner was the few Catholics that were in town. So anybody who was different from the white Protestant majority got segregated at the time of burial to these remote areas. And with them were strangers, paupers, criminals, victims of crime, bodies that washed ashore, anybody that wasn't part of the norm per se, would end up in these far-flung areas. And so, you know, it's interesting to see that from a historical perspective, how that played out in the 17 and 1800s in that space. Today, of course, we don't do that. People are welcome to be buried wherever, and there is some natural separation. I'm not going to say segregation, but there is a natural separation by religion mostly. There are many people that choose to be in a Catholic cemetery or a Jewish cemetery, and that's totally fine and acceptable, and it's not put upon by society. It's a voluntary thing. But in those days, people were classed, and it was, if you're not white, Protestant majority, you're not going to get buried with us, and that's how it went.
Yeah. Yeah. This is more of what I was talking about, how the physical space that we create reflects the values of the society
Yeah.
that we have at the time. So just like the iconography and like this layout of the cemetery reflects the social movements that were and like artistic movements that were happening, the exact same things happens with the physical actual layout of the cemetery.
Yeah.
I think on the show, very rightfully so, because it's normally a show about biological anthropology, we focus so much on bodies that we sometimes don't really think about like the physical spaces.
Where they ended up. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Right.
And like you
Yeah.
can see a lot of the effects of class and race and et cetera on the bones themselves, but like it's also the whole environment around the bodies.
Yeah. Right. Yeah, and these folks didn't get markers either. For the most part, they're all in unmarked graves. I mean, there were very few Quaker graves. The Society of Friends didn't even allow it for many years. The African Americans tended to they didn't have the money for markers. They would have used stone or a wooden stake or something. But their practices also were to do their burials in the evening. Away from the prying eyes of the white folk. They wanted to just be private and do their burials then. So, it goes beyond what does the gravestone look like in the space. It's how were they all acting and interacting with one another? What was the practices of the time? And it's just that particular cemetery. I mean, there are many of them in New England that are 300 years old or more, but there's so much history there and so many different levels to be explored. It's really kind of fascinating. Yeah.
Yeah, no, it certainly is. I think sometimes people go to historic sites, and I totally understand this, like going to a historic site and being like, wow, this is a nice house. But like there's a lot of subtext buried within the architecture, within the landscape design, that if you know what you're looking for, it can really tell you a lot about
Right.
how people interacted in the past.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I agree. I mean, one of the things I love doing when I'm doing tours is, most people who are what I call sort of the casual tourists that are coming in because they know it's a historic site and they want to see what it's about. They're coming in and they want to see the oldest stone and the most famous person and those kind of things. And we always show them that. But what I really enjoy doing too is pointing out somebody made this. Yes, there's a person below ground that this is memorializing. And yeah, that's a really cool design that you're looking at. But somebody carved that. There was a man behind this whole notion of what you're looking at. And just to sort of point out how important they were to the community at the time, but really unsung heroes. I mean, they were like, the plumbers and electricians of the day today, but they contributed a lot to society and left behind some beautiful artwork to boot. So yeah, I always like to point that out so that people sort of appreciate that it's not just Mr. Smith and Mrs. Smith are buried here, but somebody made that for them.
Yeah. Yeah. This has been a really wonderful conversation.
Oh, good. For
and
me too.
I'm so glad. I'm if you ever would like to come back, you're more than welcome to. I do finish every episode with the same 3 questions for everyone.
Yep.
The first question is, if someone is interested in learning more about historic cemeteries in general or your work in particular, where is a good place for them to start?
Yeah. So I'll promote my own books. I've written 5 books. 2 of them I would point out here for people that might want to dig a little bit deeper. If you're interested in learning about the history of Portland's oldest cemetery, which is Eastern Cemetery in Portland, that covers 350 years of history in a colonial space. That's called Portland's Historic Eastern Cemetery. That's by me. The other one is about the stonecutter Bartlett Adams, and that one's called Early Gravestones in Southern Maine, the genius of Bartlett Adams, and it really tells his life story and shows examples of his work and talks about his shop life. So those are my two. But if you're interested in learning, especially about the rural cemetery movement in America, there's a wonderful book that I would recommend called Pleasure Grounds of Death by Dr. Joy Gigier. It's Giguere. I can send you this on email if you want. I don't know.
Yes, please.
Okay. So her book is really wonderful, and it's not regional to New England. It really tells the story of America's garden cemetery. So I'd recommend that one. More locally, but also an excellent read. Abby Burnett from Arkansas wrote a book called Gone to the Grave. I thoroughly enjoyed that. And even though I'm not from Arkansas, I really got a lot out of it. And it tells a lot of the practices that were occurring through the time frame that she covers. And then one more I'll recommend, which is for people who want to really geek out on old gravestone carvers. There's a 2-volume series called From Slate to Marble by Jim Blackowitz. They're monster books. They weigh a ton together, but they really cover the landscape of the carvers that came out of the Massachusetts region, which was the key region where these guys were in that time. And then can I do two more quick ones?
Of course.
Yeah. So for a bit of fun, this is the general scope. There's a book called Buried Alive. So you can guess what that's about. By Jan Bonderson.
Just to be clear to listeners, that was actually a problem. That was a problem that would happen. People would think that other people were dead and they weren't. That was a legitimate problem. It's horrible.
And it arose from the fact that bodies had to go into the ground so quickly after death that they would sometimes mistakenly put somebody in the ground who was not quite dead. And then later on, they would find these horrific reminders or, things that prove the person was in fact buried alive. It's horrible, but it's a fascinating read. And then the last one on this list is Medieval Bodies by Jack Hartnell, which brings us way back to that time. So I'll send you an email about those. So I think that's your first question. I think you have three though, right?
I do. But I'm going to pitch in two as well. One is This Republic of Suffering, Death and the American Civil War by Drew Gilpin Faust.
Oh, nice.
I loved that book. It's incredible, and it really does focus on death in the Civil War and changes in American culture and perceptions of death. And then the other one is a book about the good death. It's called Death, Religion, and the Family in England, 1480 through 1750 by Ralph Holbrook. That one is from 1998. And he had a follow-up edited volume called Death, Ritual, and Bereavement in 2021. Super excellent book. About conceptions of death and what makes a good death. And then my last recommendation, sorry, I really love this topic
it's
too.
It's your podcast. You can do as many as you want. I give you permission.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that. The last one is, you know what I'm going to do too, because I can. Dealing with modern conceptions of death is Smoke Gets in Your Eyes by Caitlin Dowdy. This is a woman who ended up actually working at a funeral home here in the Bay Area. And she talks about how different modern cultures view and approach death and how divorced from death we've become in the modern world. We just don't see it at the same volume as our ancestors did, which in many ways is good, but in other ways means that we don't deal with it very well.
Right.
And then if you are an archaeologist, James Dietz's In Small Things Forgotten.
Oh, yeah. That's a great book.
I love that book. And I think it really lays this foundation of the things that we were talking about how material remains, material culture can inform so much about the past.
Yeah.
So strong
recommend that's a great
there.
book. I have that one. I would recommend that one too.
It's super well written. I love that
and it's
one.
a quick, easy read too, but it's got lots of great stuff in it.
Yeah, it's got great pictures. Anyway, second question.
Okay.
What are you reading for work right now?
Okay, so I'm not, as you probably know, I'm not working, but this has taken over my life in the last 10 years and has become my full-time job, designing cemetery tours and writing books and giving presentations and blah, blah, blah. So I guess we can call it work. So this is so on topic. I just got this in the mail today. This is my current book. I'm holding it to show you. It's called Body Snatching. So it's about grave robbery, which I'm way into right now because I just came upon a story of a local grave robbery that occurred in 1898 that's really, really well documented. And then newspapers of the period and the whole thing. So I just got way into it. So I'm starting that book right now, Body Snatching, The Robbing of Graves for the Education of Physicians in the Early 19th Century America. That's by Suzanne Schultz. So that's my current my current work read. Yeah.
Also another thing that happened with alarming regularity.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, and that there, yep.
Sadly.
Anyway,
Yeah.
I have a lot of thoughts about that as well. Third question is, what are you consuming for fun right now?
So right now for fun is bird watching guides from Hong Kong, Australia, and Japan because I'm spending the winter there.
Oh, that's so exciting.
So I'm trying to just get geared up on what I'm going to see in those three spots. Yeah.
That's really exciting. Well, I hope
Yeah.
we have so much fun on your trip, and thank you so much for spending
Thank
time
you.
with us.
Thanks. It was my pleasure.
Thanks for joining me for this episode of the Anthrobiology Podcast. If you have questions or comments, you can reach me at gabby.lapera@anthrobiology.com. That's spelled GABY.LAPERA@anthrobiology.com. This show is produced by me. Music courtesy of Chad Crouch, aka Poddington Bear at Sound of Picture.